Thank you very much for inviting me today. So what I'll be talking about today, my presentation will be a bit different in its angle from what most of the things we've been hearing over the past 3 days, because I'd like to shift the focus of the discussion from private enforcers and adjudicators to state actors, and in particular policemen, who have been asserting their right to punish outside the legal framework. Yeah? So that study is empirically rooted in the city where I've been conducting most of my fieldwork over the past 2 decades, Karachi, Pakistan's largest and most turbulent city. However, the discussion, the paper, and the presentation I'll be making today echoes beyond the case of Karachi and Pakistan. It echoes larger debates on police vigilantism, a notion which was recently revived by anthropologists of policing, such as Beatrice Jauregui in the case of India, or Sarah Cooper-Nock in the case of South Africa, or Ollie Owen in the case of Nigeria. So this debate on police vigilantism, which seems to be oxymoronic in terms, actually is a revival of a much older discussion about police vigilantism, which dates back to the 1930s in the United States, and in particular to the debates around a commission known as the Wickersham Commission, which was the first to document extensively police brutality and the use of third degree in police stations across the US at the time. So I think it's important to remember that there is a longer historicity to these debates. So I'll come back to this debate at the end of my presentation, but for now, I'd just like to say a few words to sum up what the paper is all about. So as I said, the paper is rooted in the recent history of Karachi, Pakistan's most turbulent city in the southern province of Sindh, a city which has been known for its complex mixture of religious, political, sectarian, and criminal conflicts. So shamefully, I don't have much time to go into details. But what I really want to emphasize here is, and this has been much less studied, is how in response to these overlapping conflicts and struggle for the city, the Karachi police has been almost institutionalizing. There's been a routinization of extrajudicial killings in retaliation against these various forms of political, religious, and criminal violence. So since the late 80s, we've seen a routinization of what are being known locally euphemistically as encounters or alleged shootouts between police forces and alleged criminals or terrorists. And there's been a revival of these extrajudicial killings after 2013 in the wake of an anti-terror, anti-criminal operation. So this state-sponsored administration of rough justice, because this is what it's all about, is inseparable from one particular social and moral figure, which you can see here on the left, such as in this poster eulogizing one of them, is the figure of the encounter specialist, as this character is known throughout South Asia, in India as well. The encounter specialist being an expert in summary executions in security forces, who's been both eulogized and vilified by the general public, the media, and cinema as well across South Asia. This is one example of a poster eulogizing the most famous or infamous of these encounter specialists in Karachi, Chaudhry Aslam Khan, who was killed by the Taliban in 2014. And here to give you an idea about the controversies around these characters, this is a screenshot from the Facebook page of the next encounter specialist who took the mantle over from Chaudhry Aslam, known as Rao Anwar, who's been the most well-known encounter specialist since then. And you can see on the right, so these are, I mean, typically the pictures that he would post on his account after every encounter. taking credit for the death of alleged militants or criminals. And you can see on the right, very, contrasted comments. The first one by this user calling himself Prince Ibrahim basically asks Allah to bring death to this dog and sister fucker, literally. The second one also asked him to go and fuck his sister, but the third one calls for long life to Sir Raho and ask Allah to make him successful. So you can see here in very strongly contrasted terms how controversial this public figure has been. So the paper revolves around this particular character, Rao Anwar, and his team of encounter specialists. Indeed, Rao has been officially credited by the Sindh police for being responsible for the death of 444 people between 2011 and 2018 under his responsibility. So he's been the most lethal encounter specialist of Karachi of recent years. And he has been publicly taking credit, taking pride for this kill count, and publicly assuming the status of an uncompromising, no-holds-barred cop. More specifically, the paper looks at the bureaucratic processes aiming to cover these so-called encounters, and in particular, one particular encounter, and the public scandal that ensued when things went wrong. So in January, in January 2018, 4 Pashtun men were allegedly killed in the outskirts of Karachi, in the eastern periphery of Malir, during a shootout with the police. The police claimed, under the authority of Rao Anwar and his men, the police claimed that these were all battle-hardened Taliban militants from the north of the country. Among the young men killed during this alleged encounter was a young man named Nakibullah Masood, who was also branded by the police as a Taliban militant. However, normally the death of Nakibullah would have gone unnoticed and would have been yet one more statistic in the kill count of the police, for which they would have taken credit. However, things went wrong, mainly because of social media, because it happened that the main victim, Nakibullah Masood, was a young man from the northern district of South Waziristan, who actually happened to be very fond of modeling, who was an amateur model, who had tens of thousands of fans on Instagram and Facebook, where he enjoyed advertising, posing, and emphasizing his happily married life. So what happened is that his large fan club on Facebook and Instagram instantly recognized him in the pictures of the police and started going against the official version of the police. This led to a major mobilization across the city of Karachi, with major protests erupting in Pashtun neighborhoods, which happened to be located strategically at the main gates of the city, and thus these protests threatened to disrupt circulation across Pakistan's major economic hub. What also has to be emphasized is that Rao Anwar had, for various reasons, which I develop in the paper, many enemies in the police who also joined the fray and fed the media with information against the official version of the police and tarnishing Rao Anwar's reputation more largely. This rapidly led to a police investigation, which in a matter of only a few days concluded that this was indeed a fake encounter and that Rao Anwar was guilty of murder. However, the trial did not really happen. Rao only spent 1 month in prison, and for other reasons, which I don't have the time to develop, but mainly because he benefited from the protection of the so-called deep state and the army's intelligence agencies, he was released after only 3 weeks in prison and till now runs scot-free. So what does that particular story tell us? First of all, and this will be my concluding comments, first of all, through this particular case and more generally through the trajectory of these encounter specialists, we see affinities between these forms of police-sanctioned extrajudicial violence and vigilantism, as the members of the Wickersham Commission had been noticing, which had led them as early as the 1930s to talk about police vigilantism. Indeed, the self-assumed propensity of these punishers in uniform to break the law for the sake of order likens police self-justice to its more civilian form that we've been discussing over the past few days. However, unlike private vigilantes, the police officers involved in these extrajudicial killings in Pakistan, in South Asia more generally, but also in the Philippines, in Brazil, or in Kenya, these police officers can rely upon their knowledge of the law as well as the structural bias of their institution and the judiciary towards their version of the facts. This is extremely important for them to cover their tracks, to sell to the media and to the judiciary their cover stories, and to maintain a semblance of legality, which is generally enough to preserve the public secrets of extrajudicial violence. So instead of police vigilantism, I would argue for the use of a different notion, which also came up in the United States at the time of the Wickersham Commission in the 1930s, which is that of police punitive work. A notion which, from my point of view, has the merit to insist on the bureaucratic dimension of police self-justice, as well as its institutional components and its ordinary nature. That is, in its parts, its integration into everyday punitive operations, which are in fact inherent to police work. Thirdly, what the case of Naqibullah Masood's death and the public scandal that ensued emphasizes is that things can go wrong with police punitive work, and when scandals do erupt, they do have some performative effects. But this is only on certain conditions. One of these conditions is the penal virginity of the victim. The victim generally has to be innocent. It cannot be a full-fledged criminal, otherwise the public scandal doesn't pick up. I could go back to that in the discussion. And secondly, the general political context is important for the public scandal to come up and take some generality. I could also go back to that, but this is what explains the mobilization after the death of Naqibullah Masood, which led to some kind of Pashtun Lives Matter, a movement which had many common points with Black Lives Matter in the US. Finally, and these are my last comments, there are some limits to the scandalization around these controversies around police killings, because, as I said, generally public anger tends to focus on one particular individual, both as far as the victim is concerned and as far as the policemen are concerned. This is always the issue of the rotten apples, which police hierarchies are generally eager to sacrifice so as to save the whole basket. This may bring a temporary respite in state violence before things go back to normal. And in fact, these public scandals can be an opportunity for these killing states, which are condoning, if not rewarding, extrajudicial violence, what we refer to with Gilles Favarel-Garrigues as vigilante states. This can be an opportunity to make clear publicly or to reassess who deserves to live and who may be put to death within or eventually without the confines of the law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurent, for this extremely interesting intervention, which I think is still tied a little bit with the previous intervention, because it's looking at the ambiguities surrounding this special police force in Pakistan. So I'm sure there will be interesting questions. Now, the next presenter is, if you can stop the sharing your video before. Sorry, Laurent.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
I
are
had
still
stopped.
sharing the video.
It's mine. Yeah.
No, it's Gilles.
Okay.
It's Gilles. Yeah.
Okay. So the next presenter is Gilles Favarel-Garrigues. Gilles holds a PhD in political science from Sciences Po and joined the CERI in 2001. His current works deal with vigilant justice in the Russian context and in a comparative perspective. He has recently published Vigilant Show and Law Enforcement in Russia, and he has also edited the Citizen Crime Watch and Vigilantism in Post-Soviet Societies, among others. The title of this presentation today is "You Are a Disgrace to the Uniform, Challenging the Police in Moscow Street." Gilles, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you. So thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And I would like also to congratulate the organizers to have coped with a challenging task, which is organizing a 3-day workshop on Zoom. So congratulations. So yeah, my fieldwork is Russia. So I guess it belongs to the global north. We have talked about in this workshop since 2 days. And here I would like to talk about the Russian vigilantes which have blossomed in Russia during the 2010s. So, of course, yeah, here again, we could talk about the historicity and the historical roots of vigilantism in Russian history, from Vazhdenie, Samasud in Tsarist Russia, the peasant justice, and also from Soviet forms of citizen involvement in policing through Komsomol and Communist Party youth organs. But however, today Russian vigilantes find their roots in the 1990s, where the first initiatives against drugs started to spread in cities, thanks to citizen initiatives. And there was one very famous in the city of Yekaterinburg called Gorod bez Narkotikov, a city without drugs, which was led by an entrepreneur relying on the local organized group in order to hunt drug addicts and also drug dealers who were supposed to belong to Tajik and Tsigan communities. What does explain that vigilante shows have spread in the 2010s? In my view, there are 3 obvious reasons. The first one is a complete and unanimous police distrust in the country, which means that not only citizens do not trust the police, but also people, for instance, like Vladimir Putin or Dmitry Medvedev, had very critical speeches against the police. Actually, it's a classical way to legitimize the power in Russia, to say that the political power and the people are together, but between them, there is a corrupt police, there is a violent police, and there are corrupt administrations which arm the efforts of the government to reform the country. So there was a huge police distrust in the beginning of 2010s. And there was a police reform in 2011, which was perceived as a failure in 2011 and 2012. The second reason is that there was a series of moral panics in the country in the beginning of 2010s, and especially about sexual issues. And for instance, there were a lot of pedophile hunters who relied on the law prohibiting propaganda of what is called non-traditional sexual relations to the minors, for instance, which fueled vigilantism and sexual, moral, cultural policing. The third reason is the development of internet and social media, and especially YouTube in the country during the 2010s. So as a result, vigilante shows blossomed in the country. When I say blossomed, I mean that when I started to be interested in this issue in 2014, 2015, there were about 40 or 50 groups involved in vigilantism, each one finding his niche. For instance, well, I will come back on this later, but each one having a niche, having a brand. Vigilante shows in Russia are an innovative mix of classic and digital vigilantism. With classic vigilantism, the common point is that it's physical coercion. And digital vigilantism is that social media are not only used in order to hunt people, for instance, alleged pedophiles, for instance, but also to show the result of the hunt, which means that social media are not only used to find the alleged offenders, but also to show vigilantism as an entertainment. The activities, the main orientations of vigilant activity in Russia in the 2010s are hunting migrants, and like an informal migration police. And here we can find a direct consequence of the diffusion of far-right and neo-Nazi groups in the country in the late 2000s. But this form of vigilantism tended to disappear in the mid-2010s. The second orientation is about moral and sexual policing. This is the alleged pedophile hunting I was talking about. And here we saw the involvement of very famous personalities among neo-Nazi and far-right Russian groups, finding here something to do after the prohibition of migrant hunting. The third one, and the one I will deal with today, is about health protection and promoting a healthy lifestyle. A healthy lifestyle in Russian is called ZOJ, Здоровый образ жизни, and it's a slogan which existed already during the Soviet period. And the fourth type of activity, of a vigilante activity in today's Russia, is road traffic police, fighting against badly parked cars, for instance, or against corrupt road traffic officers. All these groups share a common modus operandi. They have a strong hierarchy, as they are all led by a leader that we know the name of, and a leader which is the incarnation, who is the incarnation of the project. The second common aspect is the branding. All these groups take a lot of time to think about their logo, to think about the way they present themselves, the way they will dress during the vigilante raids, vigilante shows, etc. And the third common aspect is the use of the camera, not only as a tool of coercion against alleged offenders, but as a tool of communication in order to produce valuable contents on internet. It does not mean that everyone or every group excels at producing contents, but the most famous among them are clearly skilled in producing and communicating their contents on internet and social media. The vocabulary also is the same, and of course it's saturated with hunting terminology. The most common names, words in Russian to talk about these vigilante groups and their action are raids, and for anti-pedophile activities, safaris. So today I will talk about the Liev Protiv. Liev Protiv means two things. The first one is the lion against, lion as the animal, and Liev is also lion as an astrological sign, Leo against. So Liev Protiv cleans Moscow squares and public space since 2014. In order to work on them, I have gathered all the videos that they have produced since 2014. I have also gathered all the sources, all the critical sources which are produced on them. And this point is important because with Laurent, we take care not only about their way of action, their own activity as vigilante, but also to the controversies that they arise in their social context. So, which means that there are also sources produced on the groups. For instance, when they are in a square, they film the scene and they will show it on YouTube, but there are other people around them who film them and who also will put this on YouTube with a different perspective and especially showing the way the vigilantes break the law in order to maintain order. And I have also directly observed the 6 raids of Liev Protiv in Moscow in the last years. So Liev Protiv exists since 2014, which is a pretty long for a vigilante group. His leader is Mikhail Lazutin, born in 1996, which means that he has ended school very early and he has started his activity as a vigilante YouTuber at the age of 18. He started his YouTube career as a pedophile hunter, inspired by the neo-Nazi leader Maxim Marcinkiewicz and his project Occupy Pedophilia, which was very famous among the Russian youth in 2014, before the elimination of the Occupy Pedophilia project by the Russian government. So since that time, since 2014, Mikhail Lazutin and his vigilante posse do raids in Moscow squares against smokers, drinkers, and partygoers in the name of the innocent children. And this is something very common for Russian vigilantes. They often act in the name of an abstract victim, which is the innocent child who is supposed to be spoiled by alleged pedophiles, but also by people showing a bad example by smoking and drinking in places where it's forbidden. Liev Protiv does his best in order to infuriate their targets, often drunk subcultural youth, provoke fights and brawls, and produce content for their YouTube channel. Of course, they will choose the most violent images in order to create the covers of their raid videos in order to attract viewers. And it's a success. I have looked at their page this morning. They have now on their YouTube, on their main YouTube page, more than 300 million views of their raid videos so far. Liev Protiv used to be sponsored by the government as civic activist in 2015 and 2016. They have earned 12 million rubles in 2 years in order to do what they do. So this is why Liev Protiv, which used to present itself as a civic project, has now turned into a full-time work. And this is the terms that Mikhail Lazutin uses himself. He used to say, oh, we are общественный проект, civic project. But now he says that Lev Protiv is Rabota, his work. So Mikhail Lazutin, it's him. You see him here on the top of the page, emptying a bottle of beer that he has seized in a square. You see the art of branding here with their logo here, and you see the kind of people and interaction they have by night in squares, which were gathered people like punks, subculture, different subculture, or simply youth who want to have a beer, not in a fancy bar, but just to share a good time together with their own beers in a square. The Lev Protiv show in 2020 is like this. As you see, there is a strong light which is produced by the camera operator of Lev Protiv. They are a kind of rank and file activist, like here, ready to fight if the people that Mikhail Lazutin talked to become furious and start to fight. Here, you can find that sometimes Lev Protiv comes to square where there is a huge crowd of youth. So when they come, we can talk about mass disorder, but because soon there are a lot of fights, a lot of movements, a lot of pepper spray, and then come the police. So the party is over. And here you can see the YouTube channel that I took this morning, I guess. And you can see that there are now more than 1,800,000 subscribers to the Lev Protiv YouTube channel, which means that this group earns revenues from YouTube. And here you can see the way they present their videos in order to attract viewers. What here he says, for instance, I will crush your head in mafioso style, for instance. You can see the fire here. You can see this atmosphere of tension, of violence, which is supposed to be attractive for the Russian youth. I have to say that health protection is not only covered by Lev Protiv, but also by other vigilante groups in Russia. For instance, the fighting against drug, here with the Youth Anti-Drug Commando, who used to exist from 2012 to 2014, who no longer exist, but who really were very representative of something which is at the core of vigilante activity, is that in order to maintain order and to protect or to defend certain laws, vigilantes are ready to break other laws. This idea of norm hierarchy is consubstantial to vigilante activities. In order to neutralize a drug dealer, I can, for instance, tie him like this and spray paint over his head, or maybe break and destroy the place he's working in. This group was very important, the Youth Anti-Drug Commando, because it benefited from implicit support from the government. It's sure, and I can affirm that, because they used to fight against a drug, which is a synthetic drug called spice, which was not inscribed in the list of prohibited substances in Russia. Therefore, the police could not fight against this drug, which is pretty serious drug, pretty hard drug. So this group existed at the time this drug was not registered in the official list of prohibited substances. As soon as it was included in the list, the group ceased to disappear, or ceased to exist, sorry. And this is another group fighting against drinking in public places. This one works in the city of Chelyabinsk in the Urals. It is led by a violent entrepreneur, which was known under the name of Yakuza in the 1990s, and which is known ZOJ, a Zdarowie Obraz Żyzni activist. As you can see, his partners in vigilantism are heavily tattooed kids who want to show a good example against people like them drinking beer in their courtyards. The name of the group is Sober Courtyards, Trezvye Dvory, and the slogan here is have a conscience. Your court is for the kids. So this illustrates this invocation of the innocent child I was talking about. So it's important to say that there are a lot of controversies surrounding Lev Protiv activity. However, these controversies are not successful as they do not put an end to the vigilante activity. So far, Lev Protiv exists and continues its activities. The most important critique are from famous bloggers who are on YouTube, or YouTubers who try to show why Lev Protiv people are wrong. And in this case, there is some level of efficiency as these YouTubers have a huge audience and try to show in a negative way the activity of Lev Protiv. What is striking is that victims of Lev Protiv try to build collective action, but it's always a failure. They are not successful in victimizing themselves, and on the contrary, they provoke victim blaming. And this is something very interesting. For instance, you see the leg here, the broken leg of a victim during a raid I attended in Moscow in 2018. There was a fight, he was drunk, and his leg was broken. After that, he tried to have his own page on social media saying, look at that, look at they did to me, this group is wrong, and we have to unite as victims in order to suppress this group. However, it was a total failure because he did not find any support, he did not find any support, and on the contrary, all the comments were saying, why did you drink in a park? Why were you drunk? Why did you say bad words to them, etc., etc. So here we talk about victim blaming, which is a kind of surprising result, but which is interesting because we have to think about it when we think about vigilantism, the capacity of the victims to present themselves as victims and to be supported as victims. So
Sorry,
yes.
If we can go
okay. So failed collective action. Maybe I will say that. So there are two specificities here with this group. The first one is clearly the intertwining in this form of vigilantism between civic involvement, moral policing, and business venture. I have already talked about. And secondly, you have to be aware that in Russia, it's difficult and it's almost impossible to talk about a relationship to the state. This is something I cannot find. You have not a relationship to the state because you have a political diversity of Russian vigilantes. Some groups are pro-governmental, some others are neo-Nazis, which are against the government. You have also shifting configurations. And with Laurent, we are fond of Norbert Elias' works, and we are very careful about the evolution over time of the relationships with law enforcement agencies. And thirdly, you can find three attitudes of the governments toward vigilante groups in Russia. The first one is explicit delegation, state-sponsored. The second one is implicit support, as in the case of the Youth Anti-Drug Commando, and the third one is repression. The last thing is that when you try to look at the interactions of left Punitive with the police, you can find three of them. The first one is that they challenge the police. And sometimes even the police say, why don't you come working for us, guys? You know? And the answer is, no, our job is to educate civil society, this kind of thing. But the most interesting part, and I will finish with this, is that for left Punitive, not only drinkers and drug addicts or smokers are the targets, but also the police. And here we can find an illustration of what Abraham said about vigilantism in general, when he said that vigilantists criticize more the state's actual performance more than the state itself. It's clearly the case here. Left Punitive criticizes police indifference, police amateurism, and they're taking to task the officers. Here on the left, you can see the cops the left Punitives have called. They are bored. They don't want to be here, but they are filmed. And otherwise, they know that the fights will be very violent. Here, you can find left Punitive judging the attitude of a cop, which in his view has not respected the law. And here you can find Lazutin arrested by the cops. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gilles. Thank you. And well, I really enjoyed your intervention actually, because it was referring to how the digital world shapes the action and the representation of the vigilantes, and even we were talking even about how monetization can change their actions. So our since there are no more speakers, because we are missing one speaker today, I leave the floor to our great discussant, Tessa Diphoorn. Tessa is an assistant professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Utrecht, and she previously conducted research on private security companies in Durban, South Africa. As some of you might know, her crucial, at least for my book, to highlight policing, private security and violence in urban South Africa. She also secured a Benny grant to conduct research about the police in Kenya. So Tessa, I leave the floor to you now, and thank you for being with us.
No, thank you so much for inviting me to act as a discussant. Can everybody hear me? My internet is a bit, okay, perfect. So thanks for having me here, also for this entire workshop. I unfortunately wasn't able to attend all of the sessions, but a few I did, and I definitely, yeah, I thought they were very inspiring. I also realized I'm the last person to speak of this workshop, so I feel somehow, no, I'm jokingly, a pressure to end this workshop on a super interesting note. But thank you to both Laurent and Gilles for your papers. I'm assuming that I can refer to you by your first name, that there's a sense of informality here that I could do that. And also your very visual presentations that I was actually very glad to see, because while reading your papers, I kept thinking, what does this look like, particularly the videos. So thanks so much for including those here today. So I actually have 2 or 3 very specific questions to your individual papers, and then I have 3 more general comments, questions, trying to kind of tie the papers together, but perhaps also, particularly the last question might be interesting to kind of the workshop organizers as well, and some things to think about. So I'll start with you, Laurent. So I really enjoyed your work on your paper discussing the punitive police work in Karachi. It reminded me also of Kenya, where in the existence of these killer cops. I think Naomi van Stapel also discussed that a little bit on the Thursday session. And I like your critique of this idea of police vigilantism. And that actually we should see these acts of killings as a part of the larger structure and the part of the larger system, rather than seeing these kind of disconnected forms of justice, which of course you try to encapsulate in the concept of police punitive work. And it actually made me think about the book by Marisol Lebrun on Puerto Rico. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. And she also talks about this notion of punitive governance. So I thought maybe there could be some interesting there. And I actually had a very specific question. And the first was, where does this term encounter specialist come from? I mean, it sounds so neutral. It sounds so technical. Is this a vernacular concept? Where does this come from? Because I found it to be, it took me a while to understand that what we're talking about is a police killing here, or a police officer, like a killer cop in a way. So I thought this was interesting. So maybe you could tell me a little bit more about this term. And I'd also be interested in knowing a little bit more about how other police officers, do they use this term as well? So is this a term that's used by others to speak about these killings, or is this also the term that police officers themselves have kind of appropriated to refer to their own actions? So who's using this term is basically, where does it come from and who is using it in trying to understand these phenomena? And then my other question was, this idea of police punitive work, I find on the one hand very stimulating, but I also question, I mean, one could argue that punitive work lies at kind of the heart of police work, or policing more broadly. I mean, we go back to some of the classical work by Egon Bittner, for example, on the police, who argues that violence is at the core of policing. And I think more recently, Mikkel Siegel also talks about, if we want to look at the police, we need to see this as violence work. So I was just wondering how maybe you relate to some of these ideas, and kind of this classical maybe idea that violence is inherently at the core of policing. And yeah, so that was more specific questions for your paper. Gilles, actually, because of your paper, I looked at the YouTube channel and I found myself in a YouTube loop that I couldn't get out of, because I was watching all these videos. So it gave me kind of maybe a new dangerous addiction. But I really liked how you showed this interesting kind of intertwinement of civic involvement, moral policing, and entrepreneurship. And I mean, it really comes up beautifully in your paper. So I thought it was really interesting. And two very specific questions. So you mentioned, and it comes a little bit more clear in your presentation because of the photos as well. But you mentioned how this group in particular tries to mimic the state police, right, in enforcing the law. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this specifically. I mean, some of the work in private security in South Africa shows how they try to mimic the state police by wearing particular uniforms whereby they look like state police officers, right? So this kind of visual mimicry. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how and you've observed this mimicking. And this is a very specific question, so I don't know if you have time for this, but I was immediately curious by if you could tell me a little bit more about the relationship between, you talk about the civic chamber that kind of financially supports these groups, and then also the state police. So in terms of kind of governance, how do these different state organizations relate to each other? And how does this in turn relate to their kind of relationship with this group? If you could say a little bit more about that. And then I have some three overarching comments or questions, if I still have time. And the first is actually, while reading both of your papers, I immediately thought about the concept that Sarah Jane Cooper-Knock also kind of developed, this idea of permissive space. And she talks about permissive space as these spaces of impunity wherein illegal violence becomes kind of permissive in a sense. And I felt that that was something that was happening in both of your papers, and maybe in many of the other papers of this workshop as well. So I was wondering if this concept could maybe help both of you in understanding the use of violence in your cases, both from kind of the more policing to the more encounter specialists. And how is this permissive space defined? Secondly, and this was something I was also thinking when reading your paper, is this idea of accountability, right? So this is in a way a very kind of legal term, But it's one that's used quite commonly in the policing literature to try and kind of direct it particularly towards state policing, but also private security. So, what mechanisms are there to ensure the policing bodies are accountable somehow? And I think in both of your papers, we see various of these mechanisms happening, and particularly the role of social media, right? This comes clearly in both of your papers. So Gilles, you talk about, for example, the use of these videos and how they act as a weapon to kind of expose offenders. But could it not also act as a weapon towards the organization itself, right? Could it also not be used by others to hold them account or to somehow make them the offenders in this case, right? So how does it work the other way around? And it made me think, of course, the use of body cameras particularly in the United States and how it relates to that. And in Laurent, I also saw that, the role of these Pashtun Lives Matter movement and the role of civil society. How do these kind of act as forms of making the police accountable? So how does this work? So has this idea of accountability emerged in your thinking, and particularly the role of social media? And then my very last question, sorry for taking a little while here, and that's perhaps for the entire workshop, and something that a question I do not have an answer to, so that's why I feel very comfortable in imposing them to everybody, but it's kind of the relationship between policing and vigilantism. And maybe this was discussed in another part of this workshop, so my apologies for potentially repeating a discussion you guys already had, but it was also prompted by the title of this panel, so Agents of Security. And it made me kind of think that when we talk about vigilantism, we often talk about certain groups or agents or actors or initiatives that are going on. And vigilantism is, in a way, it's not a verb. And I don't want to get into a kind of a grammar linguistic discussion here, but policing is a verb, right? It refers to something that's ongoing, an activity, a processual dimension. So I was kind of wondering, what is this relationship between policing and vigilantism? Is vigilantism a certain type of policing? Particularly, Gilles, you talk about moral policing. So is it a type of policing, or is vigilantism a more kind of overarching framework that supersedes different forms of policing? So yeah, this is a question I have, and both conceptually, but also empirically, right? So how do these two different terms relate to each other? Anyways, that's for some of my thoughts, but thanks again for those papers and having me here today.
Thank you so much, Tessa. You were perfect in time. So if I don't know which one between you, maybe Laurent, I see you have the microphone open already. Okay.
Thank you so much, Tessa. I think, you really pointed the major issues which I was trying to raise, and maybe some of the shortcomings as well. First of all, so the easiest empirical question, where does the category encounter specialist come from? Encounter, it really comes from police lingo at first, because encounter is the police term across South Asia. It started in India, but it spread in Pakistan from, I think, the late 60s, early 70s onwards. It was originally a term used, at least in India, in counterinsurgency operations. And it was meant to refer to, euphemistically, two shootouts between police or military forces and alleged insurgents. The term, and immediately, from the 70s onwards, there has been a deep suspicion around this term encounter, which is very often conflated with an equally common vernacular expression, so to speak, which is fake encounter. Because generally those shootouts between police and alleged terrorists or criminals only leave dead people on one side and never on the other. So the police always escape unscathed from or with very minor injuries. And then the whole setup, as you could see on the pictures that I was showing, there is something very stereotypical in the staging of the bodies, who always have the weapon near their hands. And so all this is extremely stereotypical. So are the cover stories. The term encounter specialist, as far as I know, but I need to do a more precise, rigorous genealogy, was popularized by Bollywood during the 1980s and 90s, with the encounter genre becoming one specific subgenre of police thrillers in Bollywood films. Importantly, the main encounter specialists in Bombay became screenwriters for Bollywood at the same time, generally co-participated, co-wrote their own legends for Bollywood, and then appropriated the terms and the lingo of these Bollywood films. So it was really a co-production. The encounter specialist was really a co-production between Bollywood and Bombay cops, which then spread to across South Asia. And the first image that I showed of this guy, Haknawaz Baloch, alias Commando, also uses the alias Dabang, which comes from a Bollywood film from the 2010s, which literally means a guy who fears nothing, no one. And the poster that I was showing, which was probably printed by himself or his devotees, had this title Dabang, Dabang, Dabang all around the poster. So as far as Karachi, you can see how this popular culture of extrajudicial violence co-produced by Bombay cops and Bollywood has been traveling and framing extrajudicial violence also as self-justice, which is also why I go beyond just extrajudicial violence, because there is a public claim to righteousness and to an ideology of social cleansing. These guys, I mean, these cops do have, I mean, an explicit discourse of cleansing the streets. I mean, the most famous encounter specialist in Bombay, Pradeep Sharma, used to say, criminals are scum and I am the cleaner. So there is intimately, I mean, something that's something we haven't, I mean, we've heard over the past few days, but that runs across rough justice from limpiezas in Colombia to extrajudicial violence across the rough justice spectrum and continuum, which I think has to be addressed as such, beyond vigilantism per se, up till, you know, self-professed rough justice on the part of state agents. Quickly, I mean, why? How do I relate to the more classical literature on policing? Obviously, I mean, Bittner and all. Obviously, I mean, I relate to that. Yet at the same time, what I'm talking about here is not merely the use of force or the enforcement of social, public, and moral order, which is so inherently parts of the police mandate, as the sociology of policing has been teaching us. But I really look at actions in the name of order making and justice and adjudication beyond the framework of the law. I mean, it's ambiguous because they always maintain the ambiguity. They really tow a fine line between self-proclaimed illegalities and lip service to the self-defense framework. But they clearly go beyond the law. And this is why I use this notion of police punitive work, which was coined by this journalist, Ernest Hopkins, which was the main investigator for the Wickersham Commission in the 1930s. And he uses the term to emphasize that at the time in the United States, in his view, the police was deliberately violating the law to enforce its own brand of order, and assuming, I quote, I don't have the terms in English here, but assuming beyond any judicial procedure and formal trials, the police has usurpated the power to punish. So it is this right, this self-professed, self-given right to punish beyond the framework of the law, playing with the ambiguity, still paying lip service to the legal framework of self-defense that I'm interested in this tension. Finally, very quickly, permissive space is, of course, a notion Gilles and I have been working with a lot, which I think indeed should be central to vigilantism, because indeed vigilantism happens in certain spaces at certain times. The boundaries of these permissive spaces are continuously renegotiated. These are not permanent states of exception. And I think, I mean, one of the major contribution of Sarah Cooper's knock notion is to go beyond Agamben, as she herself claims, to look at more contingent spatial formations of rough justice. And in the case of the encounters I'm talking about, this generally happens, not systematic, but very often they have a stereotypical scenery, which are those remote places, abandoned houses in the outskirts of the city, in the wee hours of the morning, where precisely, I mean, the permissive nature of police punitive work is assessed in its spatial and temporal constraints. Okay.
Thank you so much. Gilles?
Okay, so first, sorry for having been long. I have just read the Davide comment I have not seen because my chat was not open. Sorry, Davide, for that. And thank you, Tessa, for your valuable comments. And I am glad you have enjoyed the paper and that you haven't understood it so well. So yeah, your first question is about mimicking the state police. Maybe what I want to show here in the paper is that the left pro-active activists want to show themselves as professional law enforcers, which is the most important, more than a police, you know, law enforcers, because they're permanently referred to law when they do their raids. I was struck every time I attended their raids. I was very I was stricken by the centrality of the reference to law in the interactions they have with the people in the street. You know, people saying, oh, you don't have the right to film me, for instance. But the activist answers, I don't have the right to film you, but I have the right to film an offense if it's committed in front of me. For instance, this kind of subtle legal dialogues are very striking and prove that the activists always try to put themselves to show themselves as legalist and as oriented by the law and by legal norms. So they want to show themselves as professional law enforcers. But in the same time, what we know about the police is that the police activity is based on discretion, okay? And with left pro-active activists, we have a kind of dystopian police, uncompromising, as if every minor offense had to be punished, which is never the case, and which is not the job of the police. Okay, fundamentally, the job of the police is about police discretion, and vigilantes show themselves as people uncompromising. So this is a form of law enforcement, which is on the one hand mimic the police activity, but on the other hand challenges it by showing an uncompromising way to make the police. Your second question is about the civic chamber. This is a very good point because yes, in Russia, for various reasons, I can't go too much in detail within, but there is a competition over the definition of civil society. What is civil society in a country like Russia? It's the same. I had a comparative paper, very interesting in this issue, that I have written with a colleague working on Turkey and showing the same thing, that there is a first generation of civil society coming from the descents, the Soviet descents, and promoting human rights, okay? But this generation vanishes and is eliminated by the government, which cooptates another civil society, which is reputed to be more constructive, which means more technical, more professional, and less critical toward the regime. So it's the case in Russia, and the civic chamber is the institution which frames this new meaning of civil society, of pro-governmental civil society. So of course, the way they sponsor activities, the way they fund different initiatives is very interesting, because you can find in the beneficiaries people like Liev Protiv, but other vigilante groups, or for instance, patriotic groups, you know, fighting against the perspective of a Russian Maidan, for instance. So yes, I do believe that the civic chamber is an institution very important in order to frame and to control social activism. Maybe the third point is about why the Liev Protiv videos are not used as a proof of their excesses. This is a good question, and here the answer is quite simple. It is because these videos are edited. And this is why it is very interesting to go and to take part in these raids, to observe them. Because what you see is definitely not what will be shown tomorrow on YouTube. Because there is a strong work of editing, taking several hours in order to show that vigilantes, that activists are always right, okay? And here, the interaction with law is very important, because, for instance, if there is a fight, the activists can't show themselves starting the fight. They have to show that the fight started because they had to react as self-defense to an aggressive offender, you know, to an aggressive protagonist. And this is very tricky, because, for instance, the leg of the man I have shown, for instance, just before the fight, Lazutin told the guy, I warn you, if you hit me, according to the law on self-defense, I have the right to answer physically, okay? And then what you don't see on the video is that one of the Liev Protiv activists give a little punch to the man, infuriating him and provoking him to the fight, which is shown on the video. This is why this is very important to understand that during a Liev Protiv raid, you have the cameras of Liev Protiv activists, but you have also the cameras of the people surrounding Liev Protiv activists. Within these people, you've got the Liev Protiv fans who just want to have a selfie with the leader and show their friends that they were there. But you have also videos, cameras of people who want to show the excesses of the group, of the vigilante group. And then when I talked about the sources I use not only the videos produced by Liev Protiv, but also the videos produced on Liev Protiv by people who want to criticize them. And this is also why it's not complicated to be part in these raids, because these people are surrounded by people filming them. So I am just one of them. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you so much, Gilles. This was very interesting.